What if everything you've been taught about aging is completely wrong? What if the crisis you're experiencing in your 40s or 50s isn't a breakdown, but actually a breakthrough waiting to happen? Today, we're exploring one of Carl Jung's most profound and least understood insights: that life has two completely different halves, each requiring its own psychology, its own priorities, and its own definition of success. And if you try to live the second half of life using the rules of the first half, you're setting yourself up for profound unhappiness. I want to start with a confession. When I turned 40, I felt lost. Everything I'd worked for, the career, the achievements, the external validation, suddenly felt hollow. I thought something was wrong with me. I kept pushing harder, trying to recapture that drive I'd had in my 20s and 30s. But it was like trying to force a key into the wrong lock. Then I discovered Jung's writings on the stages of life, particularly his essays in the structure and dynamics of the psyche, and everything clicked into place. What I was experiencing wasn't failure. It was my psyche demanding a fundamental shift in how I approached existence. Jung observed something that most psychologists of his era missed entirely. Human life isn't a straight line of continuous growth. It's more like a book with two distinct volumes. The first half, roughly from birth to 40, follows one set of developmental imperatives. The second half, from 40 onward, requires something completely different. And the transition between these two halves, that's what we incorrectly label as a midlife crisis. Here's what makes this so important, especially for women. Our culture is obsessed with the values of life's first half: youth, expansion, acquisition, building, achieving, climbing. We're sold the lie that these same values should carry us through our entire existence. More money, more status, more achievement, more of everything, all the time, forever. But Jung recognized that this approach leads to what he called damage to the soul. The person who tries to live their 50s like their 20s isn't being youthful. They're being psychologically stunted. They're refusing the call to a deeper, richer, more meaningful form of existence. Think about it this way. In the morning of life, you're building a house. You need ambition, energy, focus on the external world. You need to establish yourself in career, relationships, society. This requires an extroverted attitude, an outward orientation. You're accumulating skills, resources, experiences, connections. But in the afternoon of life, the house is built. Now the question becomes, who's actually going to live in this house? What's the interior going to look like? What meaning will fill these rooms you've constructed? This requires a completely different orientation, an introverted turn toward your inner world, toward questions of meaning and purpose that can't be answered by external achievement. And here's where it gets interesting for women specifically. We're often socialized to remain in a perpetual state of external orientation, caring for others, managing relationships, performing emotional labor, maintaining our social roles. The culture doesn't give us permission to make that inward turn that Jung says is essential for the second half of life. So we end up exhausted, depleted, wondering why nothing feels fulfilling anymore, even though we're doing all the right things. It's because we're trying to run software designed for life's morning on the hardware of life's afternoon. The system keeps crashing because there's a fundamental mismatch. Jung was adamant about this. He wrote that we enter the second half of life wholly unprepared, taking this step with the false assumption that our truths and ideals will serve us as hitherto. In other words, we think the playbook that worked for our 20s and 30s will keep working. It won't. The depression, anxiety, and sense of meaninglessness that strikes so many people in their mature years aren't inevitable features of aging. They're symptoms of refusing to evolve, of clinging to an outdated program for living. And the solution isn't anti-aging cream or trying to look younger or having an affair or buying a sports car. The solution is understanding what life's second half actually requires of us psychologically. So what exactly does the first half of life demand from us, and why does that program stop working? Let's get specific about what Jung called the morning psychology and why it becomes toxic when carried into the afternoon. The first half of life is fundamentally about separation and establishment. If you think about a child's psychological development, it begins in what Jung called the magic circle of the mother and family. The infant is psychologically merged with the mother. There's no clear boundary between self and other. The entire developmental arc of childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood is about breaking free from this merged state and establishing yourself as an autonomous individual. You need to separate from your family of origin. You need to develop self-reliance and independence. You need to find your place in the social world, which means building a career, earning money, possibly getting married, perhaps having children. You need to establish your own identity distinct from your parents' identity. This is the work of expansion and growth. Jung emphasized that this requires what he called an extroverted attitude. Your attention needs to be directed outward, toward opportunities, toward other people, toward the external markers of success. The introvert who spends their 20s and 30s primarily focused on their inner world, on reflection and solitude, often misses crucial developmental milestones. They might struggle to establish a career, form romantic relationships, or achieve financial independence. There's a certain tragedy in this, as Jung's colleague Jolanda Jacobi pointed out. The naturally introverted person, the reflective seeker, often feels like they're losing while everyone else is winning during life's first half. They watch their more extroverted peers get married, climb career ladders, accumulate wealth and status, while they're still searching, still questioning, still inward focused. But here's the twist, and this is crucial. The person who excels at life's first half often completely fails at the second half. The extrovert who builds a brilliant career, achieves tremendous external success, accumulates power and status. This person is often totally unprepared for what comes next. Because all of that external achievement, while necessary and valuable, doesn't actually answer the deeper questions that emerge in life's second half. What questions am I talking about? Questions like, who am I beyond my roles and achievements? What do I actually value when I strip away what society says I should value? What parts of myself have I neglected or repressed in order to succeed? What does my life mean? What legacy am I creating that goes beyond money and status? How do I face my mortality? These aren't questions you can answer by working harder or achieving more. In fact, the more you try to answer them through external means, the more desperate and hollow you feel. This is why so many successful people hit their 40s and 50s and experience profound crises despite having everything society says should make them happy. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in his private practice. He wrote that his midlife patients weren't struggling with typical problems like career obstacles or relationship issues. They weren't concerned with how to remove the obstacles to a man's profession, or to his marriage, or to anything that means a widening of his life. Instead, they were confronting something more fundamental, the task of finding a meaning that will enable him to continue living at all. Think about how radical that is. These were successful people, people who had achieved what they set out to achieve in life's first half. And yet, they were questioning whether life was worth continuing, not because of external failure, but because of internal emptiness. They'd won the game of life's morning, and the prize felt meaningless. This is what happens when you over-identify with what Jung called the persona, the social mask, the role you play in the world. In the first half of life, a strong persona is incredibly useful. Your professional identity, your social role, your carefully constructed public self. These things help you navigate the world, achieve your goals, and establish yourself in society. But Jung warned that many people become nothing more than their persona. They confuse the mask with their actual face. They derive their entire sense of self from their job title, their social status, their role as parent or spouse or professional. And Jung was scathing about this, writing that if you looked beneath the impressive exterior of such people, you'd often find a very pitiable little creature. The tragedy is that the very things that made you successful in life's first half, your ability to conform to social expectations, to perform your role excellently, to achieve external validation, these become prison bars in life's second half. Because what you need in the afternoon of life isn't more conformity or better performance. What you need is authenticity, meaning, and connection to the parts of yourself that you've been ignoring. For women, this is particularly complex because we're often rewarded for maintaining our persona indefinitely. The good mother, the supportive partner, the competent professional, the agreeable team player. These masks can become so comfortable, so automatic, that we forget we're wearing them. We forget there's an actual person underneath with needs, desires, and potentials that have nothing to do with these social roles. And when life's second half demands that we remove the mask and discover who we actually are, it can feel terrifying. Because who are you without your roles? Who are you when you're not performing competence or care or agreeability? Many women would rather cling to the exhausting performance and face that question. Now let's talk about what Jung believed the second half of life actually requires from us. Because once you understand this, the so-called midlife crisis starts to look less like a problem and more like an invitation to transformation. Jung was clear: what youth finds outside, the mature person must find within. The entire orientation must shift from extroversion to introversion, from expansion to depth, from accumulation to integration. This isn't about becoming a hermit or abandoning your responsibilities. It's about where you locate your source of meaning and fulfillment. In the first half of life, meaning comes from external achievements. You feel good when you get the promotion, when you buy the house, when you reach the milestone. But in the second half, external achievements stop providing that sense of fulfillment. You can keep achieving and acquiring, but it feels increasingly hollow. This isn't because there's something wrong with you. It's because your psyche is demanding a different kind of nourishment. What the mature psyche needs is what Jung called psychological wholeness. This is the process of becoming a complete person, of integrating all the parts of yourself that you've neglected or repressed during the expansionary phase of life's first half. And this process, Jung insisted, is inherently meaningful and rewarding in ways that external achievement can never be. Think about all the aspects of yourself that you had to set aside to succeed in life's first half. Maybe you were naturally creative but chose a practical career. Maybe you were deeply introverted but forced yourself to be socially outgoing to build your network. Maybe you had spiritual or philosophical interests but didn't have time for them while building your career and raising children. Maybe you had artistic talents, intellectual curiosities, or lifestyle preferences that didn't fit with the life you were constructing. Jung believed all of these unlived aspects of yourself don't just disappear. They accumulate in what he called the lumber room among dusty memories, and sometimes, he noted, they are glowing coals under gray ashes. These unlived parts of yourself are waiting, and in the second half of life, they start demanding attention. The psychologists Robert Johnson and Jerry Rule built on Jung's ideas with their concept of living your unlived life. They describe it as the most important task of our mature years. Your unlived life includes all those essential aspects of you that haven't been adequately integrated into your experience. It's the woulda, coulda, shoulda that echoes in the back of your head. It's the second guessing of life choices. It's the fantasy version of yourself that you've been carrying around, wondering what might have been. Here's what's crucial to understand. Living your unlived life doesn't mean regretting your choices or abandoning your responsibilities. It doesn't mean divorcing your spouse because you wonder what it would have been like to marry someone else, or quitting your career because you wish you'd chosen differently. That's the immature, destructive version of midlife crisis. The mature version is about finding ways to integrate those unlived potentials into your remaining years. If you always wanted to be creative, but chose a practical career, the second half of life is when you finally give yourself permission to paint, write, or make music. Not to become famous or successful at it, but because that part of you needs expression. If you've been extroverted and socially focused your whole life, maybe now is the time to explore solitude, meditation, or deep study. Jung also emphasized the importance of seeking wisdom in the second half of life. Not just knowledge or information, but wisdom, the kind of deep understanding that comes from living, reflecting, and integrating experience. In traditional societies, Jung noted, older people were the guardians of mysteries and laws, the keepers of cultural wisdom. They had a vital role as mentors and guides to the younger generation. But in modern Western culture, Jung observed something tragic: old people trying to compete with the young. Instead of embracing their role as wisdom keepers, they're getting plastic surgery, following youth fashion trends, desperately trying to remain young. They've abandoned the meaningful archetypal role that should be theirs in favor of a pathetic imitation of youth. Wisdom, Jung believed, comes to those who display openness toward life and all its experiences. It requires solitude and reflection. It requires engaging with great works of philosophy, psychology, literature, and science. Most importantly, it requires a willingness to explore the depths of your own mind, to understand your own psychology with radical honesty. This pursuit of wisdom serves multiple purposes. First, it helps you navigate the trials and tribulations of life's second half with more grace and resilience. Second, it's inherently meaningful. The pursuit itself brings fulfillment. And third, when you attain wisdom, you can offer something genuinely valuable to the younger generation. You become someone worth listening to, not because of your status or achievements, but because of your depth of understanding. For women, this wisdom-seeking phase can be particularly powerful because we're often socialized to be caretakers of others rather than students of life. We're expected to already know how to manage everyone's emotions, solve everyone's problems, maintain harmony. The idea that we might need to retreat into study, reflection, and self-exploration can feel selfish or indulgent. But Jung would argue that this inward turn is not only necessary for your own psychological health, it's also the only way you can eventually offer genuine wisdom rather than just caretaking. The woman who has done her inner work, who has explored her own depths, who has integrated her shadow and lived her unlived life, she has something real to offer. She's not just performing the role of wise elder, she actually embodies wisdom. Another crucial element Jung emphasized for the second half of life is changing our relationship to death. In a culture largely devoid of meaningful religious or spiritual frameworks, many people fear death to the point of neurosis. This fear becomes particularly acute in life's second half, when mortality becomes less abstract and more immediate. Jung saw countless patients paralyzed by health anxieties, obsessively monitoring their bodies, unable to enjoy life because they were so consumed with trying to avoid death. And he recognized that this approach was not only miserable, but also counterproductive. The person who spends their remaining years fighting against death isn't actually living. They're already dead in the ways that matter most. Jung's solution to death anxiety was radical. View death not as something to be fought against, but as life's ultimate goal. This sounds paradoxical, perhaps even morbid, until you understand what he actually meant. Jung believed that a life directed toward a goal is generally better, richer, and healthier than an aimless one. And he observed that it's better to move forward with the stream of time than to fight backwards against it. When he encountered elderly patients who couldn't accept their mortality, who were desperately clinging to youth and health, Jung saw them as psychologically unhealthy, as feeble as young people who can't embrace life. He went so far as to say that it's hygienic to discover in death a goal toward which one can strive. That shrinking away from death is unhealthy and abnormal, robbing the second half of life of its purpose. Think about what this means practically. If you accept death as your eventual destination, you stop wasting precious energy on denial and anxiety. You can focus instead on living fully in whatever time remains. Now, Jung wasn't advocating for a nihilistic view of death as complete annihilation. His extensive study of world religions, mythology, and even parapsychology opened him to the possibility of something beyond physical death. He didn't claim to know what happens after death. He recognized it as a great mystery. But he encouraged his patients, especially elderly ones, to remain open-minded about the possibility of continuity. Jung actively worked to strengthen his patients' belief in some form of immortality, not because he was certain it was true, but because he saw this belief as psychologically beneficial. When you believe death might be a transition rather than an ending, it becomes easier to accept it as a goal. You can approach it with curiosity rather than terror. For women specifically, this shift in perspective around death can be liberating. We're often so consumed with maintaining youth, beauty, and vitality. The culture bombards us with anti-aging messages constantly. But when you accept mortality as natural and even as purposeful, you can stop fighting a battle you can never win. You can invest that energy instead in depth, meaning, and authentic living. The irony is that people who accept death often live more fully than those desperately trying to avoid it. When you're not paralyzed by health anxiety or obsessed with looking young, you have more energy available for what actually matters: relationships, creativity, wisdom-seeking, living your unlived life, psychological growth. Jung saw death as the completion of life's arc, the final integration. And approaching it consciously with acceptance rather than resistance allows you to harvest whatever wisdom and meaning the experience offers. The person who reaches their final years having done this inner work, having turned inward and discovered who they really are beyond their persona, this person can face death with equanimity rather than terror. So what does all of this look like in practice? How do you actually navigate the second half of life in the way Jung recommends? Let's get concrete. First, you need to detach from your persona. This means recognizing the difference between the roles you play and who you actually are. Start by asking yourself, who am I when I'm not performing my job? Who am I beyond being a parent, a spouse, a friend? What do I want that has nothing to do with others' expectations? This can be terrifying because many of us have built our entire identity around these roles. But Jung insisted this detachment is necessary. You need to find the person underneath the mask. Second, you need to turn inward. This requires creating space for solitude, reflection, and self-exploration. Maybe that means journaling, meditation, therapy, or simply long walks alone. The point is to start listening to your inner voice rather than constantly orienting to external demands and expectations. Third, identify and start living your unlived life. What aspects of yourself have you neglected? What interests, talents, or desires did you set aside to build your career or raise your family? The second half of life is your opportunity to reclaim these parts of yourself, not for achievement or recognition, but for wholeness. Fourth, seek wisdom intentionally. Read deeply in philosophy, psychology, spirituality, literature. Reflect on your life experiences and extract meaning from them. Consider what you've learned that might be valuable to share with younger people. Allow yourself to become a student of life rather than just a performer of roles. Fifth, make peace with your mortality. Stop fighting against aging. Stop obsessing over youth and appearance. Accept that death is coming and consider what that means for how you want to live your remaining years. What matters when time is finite? What legacy do you want to leave that has nothing to do with money or status? And finally, be willing to disappoint people. The inward turn that Jung advocates will inevitably upset those who benefited from your outward orientation. Family members might complain that you're not as available. Colleagues might notice you're less ambitious. Friends might feel confused by your changing priorities. Let them be disappointed. Your psychological wholeness is more important than their comfort. This is perhaps the hardest lesson for women especially, because we've been trained to prioritize others' needs above our own psychological development. But Jung is clear: if you don't make this turn inward, if you continue living for external validation and others' expectations, you'll reach your final years with profound regrets. The second half of life is your chance to become who you actually are rather than who you've been pretending to be. It's your opportunity to harvest meaning, cultivate wisdom, and achieve psychological wholeness. But only if you're willing to release the program that worked in life's morning and embrace something deeper. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people refuse to make this shift. Instead of heeding Jung's wisdom about the second half of life, they cling desperately to the strategies of youth, and entire industries profit from this refusal. Look around at what our culture sells to people in midlife. Plastic surgery to fight aging. Fashion and lifestyle trends designed to help you stay young. Fitness obsessions that border on neurotic. The pursuit of younger romantic partners to prove vitality. Luxury purchases to demonstrate continued success. All of it is an elaborate defense against the psychological work that actually needs to happen. Jung would see these behaviors as compulsive attempts to deny reality. The person getting their fifth facelift, the 50-year-old dressing like a 20-year-old, the executive obsessively pursuing the next promotion despite already having more than enough. These aren't people living fully. They're people running a race against time, and it's a race they cannot win. The tragedy is that while they're busy pretending to be young, they're missing out on the profound gifts that only the second half of life can offer. They're sacrificing depth for the illusion of youth, meaning for the appearance of vitality, wisdom for the performance of success. And time will catch up eventually. The body ages regardless of how much money you spend fighting it. Your career eventually ends. Your children grow up and leave. The external scaffolding that held up your identity starts to crumble. And if you haven't done the inner work, if you haven't discovered who you are beyond your roles and achievements, you're left with nothing. Jung warned that the problems of the second half of life cannot be solved by the old recipes. You cannot put the clock back. Life has a natural arc, and denying it only leads to suffering. The person who reaches 70 still clinging to the values of 30 will likely be consumed by regret, bitterness, and a sense of having wasted their precious years. But it doesn't have to be this way. You can choose differently. You can heed Jung's wisdom and make the turn inward. You can detach from your persona and discover your authentic self. You can live your unlived life, seek wisdom, and make peace with mortality. You can embrace the afternoon of life with its own beauty, depth, and meaning. Yes, it requires courage. Yes, it means disappointing people and releasing old identities. Yes, it feels uncomfortable and sometimes frightening. But the alternative, spending your remaining years in desperate denial, chasing youth while meaning slips through your fingers, is far worse. Jung believed that just as the sun withdraws its rays at the end of the day to illuminate itself, we too must withdraw our energy from the external world and turn it inward. This isn't decline, it's transformation. It's the beginning of life's richest chapter, if only we're brave enough to turn the page.